right, any and all VA therapists to the front of the room. I guess first we'll start with our disclosure. Yeah, there we go. We have no financial interest to disclose or any commercial relationships. And by the way, we're not experts in physics. Are there any experts in physics in here? Any engineers? You. So basically, yeah, we're not here to talk about equations or anything today. So if you came here to learn about formulas and doing math, you're not going to see that because I'm not a very mathematically oriented person. But and actually when I was in college, I didn't even go to my physics class, to be honest. I was 18 years old. I was in an OT program that had 57 females, 2 other guys. Just got out of rehab, so yeah, I found other things to do at 8:30 in the morning. But what I did find over time was that physics and Pythagoras and those types of things become really essential to being able to do a thorough activity analysis when doing seating. So our objective today is to take the basic physics concepts that we all learned probably before we even knew that we were going to be seating clinicians and apply them in a common sense way that really allows us to get a more in-depth, detailed activity analysis when we look at the person we're working with as they use their seating system in their wheelchair, and not just their normal environment is, but every environment of use. So just relax, put your Newton goggles on, and let's start the show. That's kind of what it's all about. As therapists, we're kind of trained in doing a certain level of applied physics when we do biomechanical analysis, when PTs do gait analysis. As OTs, we usually don't get quite as much of that, but that's why we work as a team and it works out really effectively. But what we really are doing is, when Rachel and I worked together, which was for a year when she was at the Human Reverse Engineering Laboratory, which is what I call my clinic up in Cleveland. That bombed 2 years ago too, so. But we both saw things in a very similar light, and it was and it's a technique I call vector visualization. Because what we really do have to do is we have to resolve those forces and make sure that there's nothing that's going to cause harm to our patient, put them at risk for an adverse event, and overall lead to bad outcomes. Come on. This is going to be there we go. There we go. So for those of you that saw Kendra and Dr. DeCiano's presentation yesterday on the clinical limits of use tool, kind of how physics fits in is it, and how we kind of view the role of the therapist is kind of the human factors engineer for people with disabilities. It's definitely a team approach, and everybody has their own level, expertise, but we can't all just stay in our lanes. We have to kind of broaden out what we're doing, because if you're just purely a seating clinician and you're not looking at the other aspects of the device, how do you effectively interface the technology to get the type of outcome you want? And so what we're kind of hoping to do today is kind of go through some examples of activity analysis, kind of using some basic physics concepts, but look at usage scenarios, performance expectations, limits of use, because that's big, and physics plays a very big part of that, and mitigation of those things, which is even more important. So this is not evidence-based practice. This was a poll I posted on Care Community a few years back. Who's been thrown out of your cantilever frame wheelchair due to an endo? And surprisingly, there was a fair number of people that responded, and where they responded was usually in the frame angle when it was 16 inches or less, the seat depth, and the frame angle is like 85 or less, 85 or 90. And I phrased this question the way I did for a reason. That's because I have a cantilevered rigid frame chair, and I learned some things from it. Let me go back one more slide here. So, but the reason for physics is, first things first, it's about safety. And if we, the one thing with using a wheelchair is people tend to, we've learned to overcome physics kind of automatically, naturally. Most of us are able to ambulate. We can do all sorts of things with giving it very little thought. Overcoming the force of gravity is really easy. But using a wheelchair is something that is outside the realm of anyone's personal experience who hasn't actually used a wheelchair. But because wheelchairs are familiar to us, it becomes way too tempting to think, I'm familiar with it, therefore I understand what the task is, especially if you're just pushing a chair around on a smooth, level environment indoors. And Pittsburgh, I have to compliment you on the carpeting, because it has very low rolling resistance, which is really, really quite amazing. And I think I've been kind of doing a little poll of other folks I've been seeing in wheelchairs, and they agree. Those are things that you don't notice, but there are things that are we notice right away, because there are these little things that are part of our experience that no matter how good a clinician you are, unless you're actually getting in and using the equipment, you're not going to identify. But also, getting back to that therapist being human factors engineers for people with disabilities, complex rehab technology may be the only medical devices that are subject to regulation that aren't necessarily safe and effective for their intended user when they leave the factory. And that's actually a good thing, because complex rehab technology by definition needs to be individually configured for the person that needs it. Major manufacturer cannot produce a power chair that's going to work for everybody, because it's not a general population of users. It's very different groups of users in very small numbers that have very complex needs. So it's not like building a car where you're always going to have the steering wheel on one side, gas and brake in given location. It's kind of building a car, but you might have the steering wheel in the back seat. That's the nature of what we do. And so there's a lot of potential risks associated with that. So again, we need to be kind of looking at it from more like a physics type of perspective, and look at the forces that are acting, and are there any sort of concerns. But at the same time, deferring to people that actually do have that expertise, because we have to recognize we have limitations there too. And the primary reason we need to do that is we're the ones that are primarily responsible for providing a safe and effective outcome for the device we provide.
So I think as we go through, you'll see that we do know that there's ways to assess safety for devices, but unless I'm really looking at the person in the device, in their environment, I really don't know if it's safe, and I really don't know if it's effective.
And we will show this, even small adjustments in a chair can make a big difference in the usability or the danger. And the other thing with complex rehab technology, there's so many infinitely configurations, and the manufacturers didn't necessarily build these products to be used with other products. So this is a veteran that I was working with. He has a freewheel on the front, smart drive on the back. Well, I don't think the owner of the, I don't think Tylight actually thought about having a smart drive on the back and a freewheel on the front at the time. Is that going to be structurally safe to use? He's also put the rack on the front too, so he's carrying additional weight on the front frame. So, we do have to kind of think along those lines, and if so again, we have to get out of that role of just being strictly a clinician, and we have to know it's realistic. We live in an era of evidence-based marketing, so we hear a lot of justifications sometimes, and sometimes it's manufacturers promote stuff and they write it in terms that are familiar to clinicians, that clinicians can identify with, but still, we're the ones that are responsible for kind of checking what they're saying and making sure that when it comes to our population, which we know better than anybody else, is what they're saying truly effective. And I don't know how many times we've gotten people in the clinic where a therapist at another site that doesn't do seating says, yeah, well, I put my hands here, and I pushed and it straightened them out, so they need a lateral support. And is that really realistic for what the actual forces of the, especially with us, we especially in the VA, we work primarily with adults, and there's only so much surface area and so much pressure that you can exert against the thoracic area to be able to correct a posture. So sometimes, it's just that pure application of force that's going to be excessive. And secondly, it's about optimizing the usability. And I think every time I've given a presentation, I've always gone back to this, but usability is just the extent to which something can be used with efficiency, satisfaction, and effectiveness in a specific context to use. And with wheelchairs, I kind of consider 4 Fs: form, fit, function, and footprint. And it's finding the best balance of trade-offs between those things to make sure that the person's as functional as possible, getting appropriate postural support, and being able to use that device in the environments where they need to use it. And when you find that, you find the optimal configuration. But usability it occurs in multiple contexts. So it's not just mobility that we're using a device that we're prescribing it for. There's all other sorts of needs that might be indoor environments, tight confines, rural outdoor areas, and the things that a person has to accomplish. So it's all about balancing those things. So no manufacturer is going to be able to test and say that this unique configuration is going to be not going to pose any concerns. It's up to us to determine if it's going to be safe or effective. Because different contexts mean different interaction of forces.
So without getting into all the details of what forces are, we've listed some that we will probably discuss today. But some of the ones that you'll hear a little bit more are applied force, reaction force, and talking about where the force is coming from. Well, I haven't had physics for a while, I had biomechanics in PT school, but I don't talk about them in these words, but this is what we're talking about. Really, I'm just looking at where did it come from, what is it affecting, what does that mean for somebody who's pushing the chair?
How many people out there visualize vectors when they do a seating assessment? Anyone?
A couple? Okay.
Let's get those Newton goggles on. Okay, and the thing we need to do is we need to use assessment, not assumption, during product selection. So when we're looking at what force is required to activate the control, to move the body part that's going to activate the control, because that's got weight to it, to move against gravity, and gravity changes depending on whether the person's upright or whether they're tilted, to overcome friction, through what type of distance do they need to move, how fast, like if somebody's trying to do a quick double tap on a head array and the head is basically a bowling ball in a Pringles can, is it realistic to think that somebody's going to do a real quick tap if they have a fusion or they have ALS? And for how long are they going to have to hold that movement? And do these forces change when power seating is used?
I'm going to say yes, because gravity changes. So anyway. And then other things that we're going to talk about, again, maybe not in these particular terms, but when we're referring to things, we are talking about inertia and different types of energy and where is it coming from. Again, we're not physicists, so just looking at kind of the overall force vectors, but you will hear us mention some of these things.
And we do a debt of gratitude to the researchers out there that have done actually very good kinematic analysis and measured very precise things related to wheel mobility. Some of the works by Boninger, Cooper, Kirby, those names are probably all familiar to you. But you also have to throw in Newton and Pythagoras too. They do stuff too. But we don't want to really get into the weeds like that, because the more you start defining things in the scientific sense of physics, then the less applicable it is to the real world. And what we're trying to do is we're looking at real world situations and those types of applications of physics. So it's kind of we want to have enough knowledge of what we're doing to be reasonably accurate using just relative concepts, but it's never going to be totally very specific. And I've read the Tomlinson article on managing maneuverability and stability of manual wheelchairs, but I could never follow the equations, and I'm pretty impressed that a PT could do that. So key wheel mobility concepts that involve physics are accounting for the distribution of forces between the user and the seating system. So basically we're looking at what vectors are at play there, what forces, and we try to resolve those things just like a physics equation as best we can. And where we do have unbalanced forces, what are we doing to mitigate those forces? A lot of times that's going to come out as far as distributing pressure evenly in a seating system. Accounting for the influence of gravity. Stability management, so looking at how the device it works in different environments, and is it going to be able to be used without any risks of tips or falls, because those can result in injuries or worse. Wheelchair skills, which Rachel will be getting into, and I have to admit, any one of us, no matter what our experience level, can always learn learn more by coming to these things. And that's why I'm like a kid at a candy store when I come to ISS. And just in the course of Rachel and I preparing this presentation, I've learned some things already that we'll discuss later. And prevention of dangerous conditions. Again, using a wheelchair is not in most of your experience on a daily basis. So something might look totally familiar, but unless you really think about what's happening as far as momentum, inertia, and especially impulse, which is a change in momentum, which is going to cause a disruption of the chair. That's going to have an effect on the user. And so we need to think about those things, and I'll share some personal experience shortly. And also just identifying those more subtle forces that are just kind of always at play and working that are going to cause longer term problems. I mean, how many chairs have center mount foot plates these days that don't have any inversion or eversion adjustability? And if they're on a mid-wheel drive model, a lot of times we're positioning at least adult males with their legs kind of tapered inward. And if they're in their position for a long period of time, are those forces going to start to have an effect? And as clinicians, we need to think about that for the long term. It might be okay in the short term, but and then when we identify problems like that, we need to also have an open dialogue with manufacturers and suppliers. So I'll tell you a little bit about my personal experience. I was a seating therapist before I used a wheelchair. I was injured. I was a C6 injured back in 1982, but I recovered enough function so that after a year I was pretty much ambulatory, and I went to school at Ohio State. Didn't use any devices other than an AFO. And when I got out of college, I didn't even specialize in spinal cord injury. I worked in traumatic brain injury, and then I did driver rehabilitation. And then I didn't find a life in the spinal cord injury world until 2004 when I started at the VA, which I didn't know was a regional spinal cord center, even though I had grown up in Cleveland. And I remember when I interviewed there, my supervisor goes, "Yeah, if you just ever want to use one of these wheelchairs, just go right ahead." And it's like, well, why would I do that? Because at the time I wasn't needing anything. But over time, I began getting just degeneration due to normal aging. I'd been functioning on kind of marginal left lower extremity function for a long time, pretty well, but I began losing a few neurons, and it would get more exhausting when I was going down to patient rooms. I was doing a lot of standing, so quickie GPV, and I used to haul that down there, and it was like, I dialed it in pretty well for me for just going down to a room, and it allowed me to function really well. And then I went to MedTrade one year, and one of the manufacturers had a backup chair that he was going to let me use for the day, and that kind of fell through. And so I decided it was probably time to plunk down some change and get my own custom rigid frame. And when you're a seating specialist, especially one that considers himself to be a pretty effective one, because I wasn't getting a lot of complaints. And you're speccing out your own chair, and you're choosing a limited adjustability model, and you're paying out of pocket because I'm of an age where I'm not finding that loophole to get in the military where I can get my equipment through the VA. So private insurance wasn't going to cover a titanium chair, so it had to be right. But so there was a lot of stress associated with that. And I was on a limited budget, but I knew it was worthwhile to invest in something that was going to last. So July 2007 is when it all began. And this is my chair. It's a Tylite ZRC actually. And at the time, Tylite's fork wasn't wide enough to accommodate a soft roll caster, so I just got the light up rollerblade caster, which I wasn't too keen on, so I cracked the magnet out of the hub so it didn't go flashing around. And I figured, oh, that's a good caster, it'll last me a long time. And it worked fine inside the hospital. But the second day I had the chair and I was going to work, I hopped in it outside in the parking garage. I'm heading for the first expansion strip in the garage, and I hit it, and it was like, doink, and out I went. Which was, and at the time I was strapping my briefcase around the front of my legs, so I got all tangled up in my chair in the middle of the parking garage, so it was quite a humbling experience to say the least. But there were definitely some usability issues with that caster. And I posted to all the world on CareCure about getting my chair in this pic of me riding with my daughter. And it was really liberating to have that sort of freedom because of the device. And I just remember though, when I was teaching her how to ride her bike, I had to have to do this little mini wheelie over every little tiny crack in the sidewalk. So that was, and part of that was the effects of impulse. You'd hit the sidewalk crack, there'd be an abrupt change in momentum, and the chair would stop, and I'd keep going. Newton would have predicted that, but of course I didn't really pay attention too much in physics to know that Newton was telling me that.
Potential child abuse if he fell out of his chair with his daughter in his lap.
That was
Just
child
saying.
endangerment. But it doesn't look like child endangerment. I didn't think it was, and heck, I'm a seating therapist. So what I did was I found this little Invicare fork in the back room. It looked like, oh, this might be able to work, and I took my stem stud and I backed it out a little bit, and I put that soft roll caster on there, and without changing anything in my push technique or anything else, it was like it absorbed the impact, and it was like it became much less of a problem. So I solved one thing there. But then, still with the cantilever type chair, when the caster hits, where's that energy go? That energy goes up the frame. So it would bump my foot up, maybe with a little bit of spasm, so my foot would kind of go off the front. And because I had an AFO with the lift, it was causing a functional lower leg length discrepancy. So on the other side, you see where, we're real big in Cleveland in taking care of the feet because we think that is an area where we really have to pay more attention. But in the case of my own feet, I just did this little buildup off to the side using ABS plastic. So that was pretty good. And then I was like, around the same time, therapists here, Hurl put out a study about when they tested the titanium manual chairs using the ANSI resonance standards. And on the double drum, there were some issues. And one of the things that was brought up was that there were 3-inch casters on the chairs that they tested. I just happened to notice this thing. I said, testing these titanium rigid frame chairs with 80mm casters was reasonable based on the fact that they were standard on titanium chairs, but specifically because the clinical experience of the clinicians around here said that these were the most prescribed chairs. It's like, Pittsburgh therapist, really? I mean, this is like a hard area to use manual chairs. So I hope that's not the case now, because that would cause a lot of issues. But and I don't know, I kind of have a little rivalry with Pittsburgh, I guess. It comes with my history as a Browns fan. But I solved that. And now the Browns might be good, so that's a good thing. So then I began realizing I was having an issue with inclines. And just, basic slopes, they don't look like anything if you're just having to walk up them. But the ADA standard is 12 to 1, which we all know. The maximum standard for an existing building is about 7.1 degrees, 8 to 1 ratio. And minivans can be anywhere from 8 to 12. But I noticed when I was doing assessments and I'd go out and look at their ability to get in the van, that I really just didn't feel comfortable at all trying to get up that minivan ramp. This is my chair, and my chair does great. It's 12 years old. It's an optimal configuration for smooth, level surfaces. So I can zip along very easily in this chair. It's compact. That my seat slope is about 14 degrees, back angle is about 95, rear axle position is about 3.5 forward. And my frame length is a little bit shorter than normal because I didn't know that Tylite started their bend before a quickie, and I used a quickie to spec my chair, but I didn't tell any of my patients that. So what happens when I'm on a 10-degree slope? Okay, what happens to my effective back angle? It's 105 degrees all of a sudden, and my seat slope is now 24 degrees. That's what it's a law that I call the conservation of contextual angles, where if you change an angle of the user, of the device, or of the environment, there's going to have to be changes elsewhere to kind of offset that change. So it really wasn't all that unusual that I did feel uncomfortable doing that, especially because I am a tetraplegic. So, a lot of the research out there has talked about a 2.5-inch adjustment in center of gravity. And some of the early studies by Brubaker, who said a lot of stuff before it began coming out in other studies, said that 2.5 made a big difference. I don't know how many people know how significant a change that is, but I just happen to have access to an Icon A1 demo chair. And it was designed to be adjustable to accommodate different sizes and different positions. But it had this little track so you could slide the seat forward and backward to do that. And it was never designed to be used with quick release knobs so you could actually do that when you're in the chair. So you had the ability to slide the seat forward and backward, which is really no different than sliding moving the rear axle forward or backward. So I could basically make it as tippy as my chair, but if I move that seat forward 2.5 inches, that would move my center of mass forward over the front casters. And you can see the difference here. So I've got pretty extreme joint angles. I really have to be careful because I do have limited wrist function. I've got normal range, but it's not going to take a lot of stress. So that's not exactly something I'd want to be doing on a regular basis. I'm going to go down to the bottom. And I'm going to slide the seat forward that 2.5 inches. So sometimes it pays to have a little bit of weight over the front casters, especially if you can't do that using your trunk muscles.
So what effectively moved, aside from him moving the chair, was the blue dot in his diagram of center of mass. It's something you can't get from specs and something you can't get from a CAD, but you can visualize where somebody's center of mass is and effectively moved his center of mass forward, put enough weight on the casters that he could get up the slope.
Okay, and here I am in the Human Reverse Engineering Laboratory, which is basically our clinic after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Trying the same thing on a 10-degree incline, which I would never do in my own chair. So you can tell it's very light on the front casters, but not so much. It looks like so much more strength when I'm doing it in slow motion. Big difference. I'm pretty much in my wheelhouse, very neutral joint angles. And it's just kind of like, it's almost like just pressing a weight, but there's no strain at all. So I wish I had the capability on this chair. And back in 2015, Jamie Borisov and I talked about dynamic wheel mobility, which is having on-the-fly configurations like this, and we still both feel very strongly chairs should have that. And if you happen to see Jamie, he's around here and he presented yesterday. His chair, the elevation, is the only chair that actually does that right now. So then you would. Thresholds and curbs. Okay, this was I'm on the PVA program committee, and I was in Orlando a few months back, or about a month ago, and the threshold going into the bathroom was a little bit higher than what it should be. It was about the height of a quarter. It's like this could be good for ISS. So is trying to power over that a good idea?
We're actually asking, so if somebody wants to answer.
Anyone?
Anybody? You can yell, you don't have to come to the mic. No, it's not a good idea.
Not a good idea. No, it isn't. And if we looked at this is potential energy all of a sudden turning really quickly into kinetic energy once that caster pops up. And that's probably going to result in a rearward tip. And we did actually have that happen to a veteran a few years back who didn't know that you were supposed to pop a wheelie over a threshold, and he tried to power over it. And he had a big old heavy folding frame chair, and it went back, and he had a subdural hematoma. He recovered well from that, but if people, we tend to take wheelchair skills for granted since we're being immersed in it here, and we're all sitting, wheel mobility professionals, but without even the most rudimentary skills, it's not a natural thing for people to think that they're supposed to pop over. They might just expect that they're able to roll over it.
So plug for what I said earlier of looking at the person in the chair in the actual environment. Granted, they're not going to go to whatever hotel this was, but teaching somebody that they need to do that. And thinking about, why would you teach somebody or give somebody a chair that was that tippy and not teach them how to do that? So plug for wheelchair skills.
Yep. Nothing against the hotel because the PVA Summit's there, and I'd encourage you all to attend because they're going to be doing training on wheelchair skills. But if you use a wheelchair, you might want to avoid room 1095. So which is better for getting over a slightly higher threshold, a rear tippy configuration or a front heavy one where you have the axle farther back or the seat farther forward.
Okay, again, we're actually asking.
Yeah,
Anybody want to guess? Front heavy.
front heavy. You know, and you know, no chair does this on the market these days. So again, trying to use my huge muscular arms there to get over. Not going to do it by not having momentum. If I timed it right, I probably could have got it there, but. So I could do it. But is it possible to do that without any momentum? Piece of cake. So one of the take-home points from this, Rachel, if you'd like to.
Sure. So it's not that Steve and I are not suggesting that you give everybody back or front heavy chairs, but just be aware of what you're doing and how you can set somebody up for success by teaching them the right skills or looking at them in the chair, not just, okay, the chair's exactly where their fingertips are, but what does that really mean as far as can they negotiate something that they need to do, and if they can't, then what are you going to do about it?
Yeah. Or if they're not in the built environment in other countries. Now this is I believe 3.5. Now what this icon also allowed me to do is I could extend the front frame out a couple inches too, so I could increase my wheelbase. Which, if you go with Pythagoras, that would be the hypotenuse between the rise of the platform and the ground, and right over. And obviously I've got a very front heavy chair there, so I almost have to nose down because it'd be very hard to wheelie in that short of space.
This is what I said. I'm not recommending you get excessively front heavy chairs. It would be hard to wheelie.
No, but this was like a very unique thing to have the ability to play around with center of mass adjustments and use it in all different types of circumstances. And it was like really, you know, it was pretty rapid learning as far as figuring out what was needed. So we're going to go into, you know, think of those concepts, and we're going to take those forward to normal wheelchair skills. I guess just one other thing is that if I lived in Pittsburgh, I would probably move my axle backward a little bit to make my chair a little bit more front stable, because you know, I'm on smooth level surfaces, and there's not a lot of those around here, except for this lovely convention center with this wonderful carpet that I just can't get over how little resistance it has when you roll over it. I'm used to the Gaylord, and it's like, I can even do my little semicircular stroke around here and not have to do my little pop and carry motion to keep my casters rolling. But I digress.
So as we go through some more videos, we want you to think about or yell out. Where are the forces that are making the chair move or wheelie coming from? And can manual chair users with any level of injury do these skills, or is it there's a pretty big contrast between higher level of injury and lower level of injury? And then if so, what do you need to teach people depending on where they are in that spectrum? So, 5-inch curbs.
It's already got me beat.
So there are a few attempts of not being able to do this, and then a successful attempt. We'll play it a few times.
Yes, this is a subject, we'll call him Lee.
So what was different? Why did he make it a third time, but not the first two? In slow motion.
Yes, and this is the latest video. It was like done this morning.
Anybody? What was different?
I'm gonna try this.
What's that? He did use a little momentum the second time.
Let's see if I
Anything
can
else?
hit the
Yeah.
Let's see if I can hit the pause button this time too, just before he gets there. Dang it.
Yeah, so the big point is that his hands were in a better place, which allowed him to do what with his center of mass? I don't know if Steve can get it to pause, but his body moved more forward, weighting the front of the chair, allowing the back wheels to roll instead of getting stuck right into the curb.
I went the wrong direction. Okay, let's see if I can.
So he's leaning over a good bit. He's purposely not moving his hands.
But, you know, even though his center of gravity it's just a little bit less than mine, look at how much of his body he's able to get in front of the rear axle.
Almost all.
Yeah.
If we could get it to pause, you can see that his trunk, his legs, and most of his butt are in front of the axle. That's the key to getting up.
Done.
So we can move on.
I guess Spacebar is not the one to do it, so.
So
maybe
7-inch curb, you definitely need momentum. You're not doing it from a stopped position.
Yeah, this is a definition of inertia when you have no momentum. There we go. And that was not sped up. That's actually the velocity that he's approaching that.
So I'm going to propose a couple questions. One is, what would change if his center of gravity was different? If you move it forward, does it make it easier or harder? If you move it back, does it make it easier or harder? And does his level of injury matter here? So I'm getting some nods. Yes, level of injury matters. Why? Because his arms are stronger? Trunk is stronger, yes.
Trunk is stronger. You know, and you know, in trying to draw it back to physics, you know, the definition of mechanical energy is potential energy plus kinetic energy. And it never dawned on me until I was preparing for this that actually the user and the muscles that they have available to provide power is potential energy. What happens if somebody's muscles are 3 out of 5 strength? Well, by definition, that's mass times gravity. I mean, that's all the force that they generate. So they really generate no power to do work. So the more, you know, the more muscles are 3 out of 5 or less, the less potential energy the user has. So it's a different way of looking at the person in the wheelchair, but actually it kind of explains a lot of those differences.
Right. So we asked in that question that we put up there, where's the force coming from to do this? Anybody?
Yeah, because a wheelie is just merely equilibrium. So that forward motion is coming from someplace.
Yeah. So he said after he builds up speed, he
moves his weight forward as much as he can as soon as he gets to that lip to carry his weight with him over the front casters, which are already on top of the step.
I just think we had a good moment there. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
And there's something that Steve and I noticed today that I hadn't noticed before. Go ahead and play if you can. If he does this, not that one. He does something with his trunk once he gets up there that I think matters. Anybody else see it? He does a quick extension. I think it matters. I'm not sure exactly because I haven't worked out the math. I'm probably not going to, but I think it does help with some of the balance and getting that quick recovery from that. I'm not sure what would happen if he didn't do that.
Yeah, this is the type of stuff that Rachel and I do when we look at these things. So let's go back and look at that one more time. Because we have our Newton goggles on. I couldn't begin to write the equation to measure that, but by applying those concepts, you know, if you've been trained in wheelchair skills, now all of a sudden if you have this physics frame of reference, how much more effective is that going to make you as far as determining what's going on when you're doing this movement?
Those are pneumatic wheels.
I think there's also reaction force coming from, it's kind of a downward push.
Yeah, because as he's pushing the wheels into the ground, as he prepares to wheelie up, he's getting a reactionary force that's helping, that's
And he's also
aided by
probably,
the pneumatic force.
getting reaction force from his back extensors.
Yeah.
So what is different if we acknowledge that if he had a higher level injury, this probably wasn't possible? Where would the reaction force be coming from, or the internal force be coming from if he doesn't have good trunk control? Where does it come when Steve does it?
Yeah.
His backrest.
Yeah, which I said.
Because if you can't lean forward and then pull back up, it's coming from the chair, not from the user.
Yeah, now I have more mass, so I would probably do better than Lee going downhill. But up a curb, I don't see it happening. Plus, I don't generate nearly the power in my arms or my abs to do that. But you know, when you begin really breaking down the task, then you can kind of determine, well, what happens if you have something that's like a mid-thoracic injury or something, where maybe they're showing some ability, some trunk control, but not perfect. Are they going to be able to do that? Is it realistic? Or what things might you want to dial into the configuration if they have to do something like that? Now we're just going to have some fun with configuration analysis, and this is really totally dependent on your participation. Rich?
So this guy, mid to low level para, has some trunk control. When you first look at his chair, you might think his axle's pretty far back. Please look at where his back is slung into the backrest. So he's actually farther back than it looks like. Why would we leave his chair alone if he, it looks like it's maybe too stable than it needs to be? So he lives in wild and wonderful West Virginia, and he is basically a shepherd on a hill in a wheelchair. So if we moved his axle forward, can he get up the hill? Probably not. What happens when he came to see Steve? I don't really remember the reasons, but they ended up ordering a rigid backrest. Probably requires some adjustment somewhere else because he uses the backrest clearly because he's slung way into it.
I try to give him some support, but yeah, that might be an issue. So I'm able to foresee that, so I'm kind of working on contingencies for that if it doesn't work. So actually, I ordered regular upholstery just in case, because he may not have that ability to bridge over. And we had a couple cases that we took out for time constraints. But when you have these very low-level injuries, they tend to prefer very low backs. But if they're sitting on a seat slope and they don't have any real back support, how many of us would be comfortable sitting in an office chair that was like slanted like that all the time? And hardware is not exactly as good as the human body structures before the surgery. So might we want to be thinking about maybe giving them a limited amount of support in the back, and also it's to allow them to have a posteriorly oriented posture so they can relax. But if you look, he has the trunk muscles, so that when he leans forward, he's entirely in front of the axle, but there's also a lot of sag in the upholstery. So, when he wants to do a wheelie, it looks effortless. And when I asked him about I said, how's your chair working? And I just, what about the rear axle? And he goes, yeah, I put it there. So, yeah, Shepard did this chair, and they did a pretty good job. I convinced him to go with 4-inch casters, but that was and some frame taper, but otherwise it served him well.
So what looks different here? His level of injury is different. His setup is quite a bit different. He does not herd something on the side of the hill.
Yeah, he's a C6 super quad.
So just things to think about when I'm looking at him propelling, looking at where the axle is, of course, because that's what I've been harping on, but where is it in relation to his body? It's under it, maybe a little bit in front of it. If he doesn't have trunk control, which he does not, then what happens when he hits that little threshold in the bathroom? Or what happens when he is trying to navigate something because he really just doesn't have the force to navigate it. So this is where he's using the backrest to do skills.
And he's really good. And I guess part of the thing that also, another factor we need to consider is the mass of the user. He's a very light, small guy, so that allows him to move against gravity much more easily. And he used to do, his shoulders gave out, but he used to do wheelchair dance and a lot of hand cycling and a lot of athletic activities. But if you also notice, there's a little third wheel anti-tipper on the back because the chair is set up so tippy that it doesn't take much to send that over. So he's not going to be able to get a lot of applied force into the pushrooms to go really fast forward, but he's able to get around on a smooth surface with fairly little effort. And the seat angles, it's kind of typical Tetra where it's more seat slope as well. And down lower in the wheels because he doesn't have hand function. How many people knew that when it's humid outside, that when you push on the hand rims, it's a better pushing day? It is. These are these little things that people who use wheelchairs know that a lot of clinicians don't. It's because the surface tension from the humidity just adds a little bit more friction. Unless you're in Florida, then it's like it gets too wet and it starts slipping. And in the cold, dry winters, it's a little harder to get traction because it wicks it away. But all those little things really make up the overall experience of using a chair. And you guys must tell us where you got that carpet. So that's his CAD drawing. So, and this was based. He had an old top-end Terminator made out of chrome moly that he wanted. He wanted the same rear seat to floor height, and they couldn't give it to him. But he wanted the same seat, so we managed to use the CAD to make that happen. Okay, and this is a case where if we don't look at these things, then we can do serious harm to our patients. This is a gentleman who had I think it was a mid-thoracic injury. He's over 300 pounds. And he had HO, pretty severe in both hips and contractures in his knees. But he went through a number of different VAs, and each time they basically, the only real option that you could get easily was a quickie 2 with an angle adjustable back, and he was like a little bit over the weight limit. But when you looked at the effects of the HO, his hip angle was actually a little bit greater than the chair, and his knees weren't going farther back. And he had a chronic wound on the back of his heel with osteomyelitis for years and years. And we kept replacing this chair and nobody was actually doing much of it. They were assuming and not assessing. When we did his chair for a fitting, I reached down to kind of put his foot up on the foot plate and it didn't move at all. It was like, there was a lot of pressure there because we had never looked. And it wasn't just my facility, it was a number of facilities. Because it seemed like the only choice for him. And he ended up eventually getting an amputation. So all of a sudden, I'm faced with the idea of having a residual limb stuck in an extension in a power chair, which was going to be his only option because there was no way you were going to put him in a manual chair and be stable. So just instead of jumping a bunch of alternatives, I just put a low profile Rojo in it and cut a channel out of the standard Permobil cushion. And it actually had a pretty good result. He also had a history of a sacral wound too, and that was because the angle, there's forces being generated that we weren't detecting. So we always got to have that open mind and make sure that everything's kind of copacetic when we're looking at these things. And physics really, much I hate to admit it now, but it's like I keep looking at it more and more and applying it. And the more I use a chair, the more I think about it. And actually I think we're going to be close to being out of time here shortly, but this was one gentleman who basically used a lot of seat slope. It was I think, a relatively low injury. But just imagine doing that. But this was his chair. So it's 14 degrees of seat slope, which is the same as my chair, except, and this Terminator was replicated on year in, year out with no questioning or anything. And he liked a low back. But what I didn't realize until I looked at his specs when he was admitted for another issue was that top end was using the frame to measure 90. They weren't using the ground like most manufacturers. So that effective back angle using a lot of other manufacturers' methods was 104. So it was doing absolutely nothing for him. So he's probably actually even having to use what back muscles he had to kind of keep him from sliding back in the seat. But this is what happened. So his hardware failed. And did the chair do that? We'll never know. But was that an area where maybe if we would have maybe paid a little bit closer attention and we would have looked, that maybe that would have maybe made a little bit of difference? And he's not the first person we've seen where this has happened. Because it seems like a lot of guys, they realize that, if they lean their trunk back, they get more, they can lighten the front end and do a lot more. But if they're doing it habitually and they're doing it against hardware, I think maybe we need to be concerned about that. Yeah. know, so he's basically sitting on a stool that was sloped since 2002. Okay, and that was actually, I think, all we were going to talk about, but just because we didn't have to, we could actually spend a whole afternoon with you, because these same things, nobody looks at the ergonomics of power chairs, but there's a whole bunch of things to look at there too. How are we on time?
Less than 5.
Oh, we still got some time? Okay.
Steve and I have different opinions of time, I think.
But again, if force equals, or if weight equals mass times gravity, and a 3 out of 5 muscle is basically, it's mass times gravity, it's generating no force, then if somebody has a progressive neurological conditions in the absence of spasticity, which in itself is an intrinsic force, wouldn't it make sense to configure power chair if somebody, you know that they're going to eventually go below that, to just configure it 3 out of 5 strength to begin with? So that's actually equivalent. That's what we do with the with our ALS chairs, and it's what I call the low level and inline position. And some chairs you can do with, some manufacturers haven't realized this, but basically armrest parallel with the seat rail at the back angle the person needs for breathing and postural stability. So basically you're just looking to give enough glenohumeral support to allow the arm to move freely. You don't want the armrest angled upward or downward, because that's going to increase friction. And then basically extend that support all the way down to the end of the wrist, so that they basically just have to place their hand on the joystick. And where I came up with this was that I was finding if I wasn't doing this up front, I was doing it later on when they came into the clinic. And also by setting the armrest so it was parallel, if they had ALS and their disease progressed, that armrest would start angling upward as they were reclining the back more, because they're connected. But there's a different thing when you look at somebody that's like a C5-ish, maybe it's a C4 tetra that's driving with the goalpost, because they're basically, they're not getting proximal stability. They're using those muscles to kind of do movements. Their shoulder girdle to move the joystick around. So where's the resistance coming from, or the stabilization? It's coming from the actual joystick. So, you know, this is an area where, again, we probably should be looking at it, because somebody's putting their arm out to the side, what's happening from a physics standpoint as far as the levers and the loads, and if they're not doing something to compensate the other way, what do they get? Joystick scoliosis, and we see it all the time. And I heard applause. Can we continue going? This is like this is not, usually when I do ISS, because ISS is the Super Bowl for presentations, I've got 100 slides all choreographed that I've been doing for months, but this one was a little bit different, but it's also a special moment. So it went pretty well, and it wasn't looking like it was starting out too good here. We were hoping for a small room, not a big venue where we can't see the audience, because we got big spotlights in our face. But this is a gentleman. Rachel, you want to cover this one?
This is a gentleman with MS that clearly has some contractural flexor tone situations going on that has caused some wounds, and really just his posture is pretty terrible sitting, supine, nothing's comfortable. And how do you manage that with those legs? So, okay. Do you have closer up on Steve?
Vector visualization.
So where is all that force from his flexor hamstrings mostly going? Into that honeycomb.
Yeah, and it would continue to bend back the more that you could shorten the seat depth, and it would still keep bending back. So at some point you had to provide a reasonable amount of force to keep it from you know, to keep that pressure, to mitigate that pressure, knowing that there's still going to be some pressure there.
And then kind of manage the adductor and from, you know, contacting each other, the knees from contacting each other.
Yeah, it's an innovative concept, toe strap, and there wasn't a lot of tension either way, so that basically we're just kind of lightly pulling it over. So we have a push and a pull going on here. So we have a pull, pulling the left leg into alignment. We have a push from the standard abductor support, or adductor on the other side. And that's what we got. And those are Comfort Company amputee supports on the permobile foot plates, because he does have some contractures there. And I mean, that's the one area we have these products out there. Rigid frame foot plates are our most power chairs with center mounts. They don't have inversion eversion, so how do we come up with solutions that do that? If it's more severe, this works like a charm. So that's from the front view. That's what we got. Now, disclosure, he's also getting some Botox, but that's, I no doubt that's helping, but this is going through and just kind of looking at what's going on. And this guy, he sat horribly for a long time, but when we actually sat down and broke it down, we got a very good outcome for him. He's happy, we're happy, everybody's happy. So,
And I think we're out of time. So I think we can just wrap up by saying I don't believe we talked about anything today that most people didn't already know or didn't know to think about, but maybe we made you think how to consider it in your practice. And just thinking about, what I like to call Newton's third law of wheelchairs. If you adjust something, it's changing something somewhere else. That's inevitable. So what are you changing? Do you know what you're changing? And how did it change how your client is interacting with their environment?
Yeah, and for a little bonus thing, I'll go ahead and slide this in here too. Now that we have these chairs that can drive at walking pace with 12 to 14 degrees of elevation, again, as clinicians, who's really thought about what the possible implications of this could be? So in the course of preparing this, I'm thinking, well, that's a pretty high center of mass. What if they're driving across the street and they hit the curb cut at the other end and it's a little higher than they expected? Would the chair tip over? And so I just talked to Quantum, and actually I was pretty impressed with the result. This is their sled testing. It's got 360 pounds on the seat, elevated. Potential energy, kinetic energy, and very stable. But what's that mean for the user in the chair if they're not wearing a seatbelt? And whose responsibility is that? Because, I think that driving with the seat elevated, it's got a lot of safety potential because it gives the user situational awareness and it puts them in the useful field of view of other people walking around. But if they're not wearing a positioning belt and the chair comes to a sudden stop because the person next to them turns it off or there's a malfunction, they don't have a seat belt, that's going to be a pretty long drop. So we see these products and it's like, but are we thinking about the implications? And I think we really have to do that too, because we can do good things but if we don't pay attention, we just stay in our lane as clinicians, then maybe it won't be such a good thing. So thank you.
Thanks.